surprise. I bet you thought I wouldn't mention it. I've been working on this book for the last 10 years. Basically, I was inspired to do so by noticing that nearly all pictures are made of pixels now. I don't know about you, but I've got the several billion pixels in my cell phone. I bet you do too. And in fact, there are so many, nearly all pictures in the world now are made of pixels. And in fact, nearly all pictures that have ever existed are made of pixels. And yet when I ask people what a pixel is, I get all sorts of screwy questions, screwy answers. People don't really understand. So the first thing I do in my book is explain what a pixel is. So one problem is everybody has the wrong idea. If they have an idea what a pixel is, it's usually wrong. It's usually this. I went out to Google and typed in the word pixel and chose images, and Google gave me this selection of what they thought pixel images look like. But I want to stress to you that pixels have never been little squares. Not now, not never. So what are they actually? And why is this misperception so widespread? So let's start all the way at the beginning with Joseph Fourier. I bet nearly everybody in this audience knows about Fourier because of the Fourier theorem that says the world, in my terms, basically everything is music. It's well known that music itself is a sum of sine waves of, let's just call them Fourier waves of different frequencies and different amplitudes, like these. You can add up waves that look like this to get any music. In fact, Fourier said you can add up waves like this to make any sound. But he went further. He said if you extrude these one-dimensional waves out towards you, you get corrugations that look like this when you look down onto them. They're two-dimensional regular waves, Fourier waves. And if you add these together, you can get any picture. What a surprise, any picture. The surprise is, and a lot of people didn't believe it at first, is that no matter how irregular the picture is, by adding together regular waves, you can get that picture. Now, Fourier is quite a character. I'll probably come back to him later and tell you all about him. I bet you don't know much about him, like the fact that he was a French revolutionary who almost got his head cut off and went off with Napoleon after that to Egypt and was with the group that discovered the Rosetta Stone and so forth. He's got quite a story. It's my chapter 1. But let's just say we've established that signals, continuous signals, whether sound, one-dimensional like at the top of the screen, or two-dimensional pictures, can be represented by Fourier waves. Now we come to the really interesting theorem. It's called the sampling theorem. The sampling theorem is the one mathematical result on which all modern media is based. It basically defines what a pixel is, and that's why it's important to understand what it is. It's an amazing theorem. Every country has a claimant to somebody who says that he proved it. In America, Claude Shannon is that person. I was a double E student. There were no computer science classes when I went through school, so I took double E, and we were told that Claude Shannon proved the sampling theorem. So when I got ready to write this book, I went out to dust off my Claude Shannon notes, and lo and behold, I discovered that Claude Shannon never even claimed he proved it first. He just said it was in the air. So then I started looking at all the other claimants, and I finally settled on this fellow right here, a Russian communist named Vladimir Kotelnikov. This is a picture of him in about 1933, and this is the paper he published that year, in which he proved the sampling theorem. Now, this was 15 years before Claude Shannon wrote about the sampling theorem at all. Now, I don't read Russian, but I can read the mathematics, and the mathematics is exactly the sampling theorem as I use it today, including the nuance, bandpass and low pass, if you speak the language. This is also fascinating. Before I get into the details of what the sampling theorem, the amazing sampling theorem, let me tell you about this amazing man who first proved it, Kotelnikov. He came from a long line of at least 7 generations of outstanding Russian mathematicians, all the way back to one who was one of 6 students of the great Euler. So this guy is not a slouch. He was a first-class mathematician, and so were 7 of his ancestors along the male Kotelnikov line. And the last picture we have of him is this one. He's the old dude on the right, wearing all of the merit badges of the Soviet Union, the several orders of Lenin and Stalin, and the red this and the red that. And he's in the Kremlin with Vladimir Putin, who is, they don't have a knighthood in Russia, but something like the equivalent of knighting Kotelnikov on the 70th anniversary of his proof of the sampling theorem at the top of the screen. I have a whole chapter about this guy. He's so fascinating. And I suspect you're like me, you've never heard of him before. He came to America in 57 and told us that Russia was going to put up a satellite. He told us about Sputnik 2 months before they put it up, and he told us the 2 frequencies it was going to broadcast at. I could go on and on about him. Fascinating man. But what I want you to remember is that shape right there. I call it a spreader, and you'll see why shortly. So what is this theorem that everybody's so excited about and everybody wants to claim? So let's just consider a one-dimensional case. Think of this as a sound, the amplitude of a sound versus time proceeding to the right. The straight line is the 0 loudness line. Kotelnikov's sampling theorem says the following astonishing thing. If you place dots along that signal, equally placed dots along that signal at a certain frequency that I'll talk more about in a moment, then you can throw away the signal between the dots and not lose anything. Let me say that again. If you sample sufficiently often, and I'll describe that in a minute, then you can throw away the infinity of points in the signal between each pair of samples. And we call these dot samples, of course. And the rest of that statement is, and not lose anything. In other words, this is the samples at the bottom of the screen are an exact representation of the continuous signal at the top. How can that possibly be? All right. And just to look ahead a little bit, of course, we call the sample of a two-dimensional function, which is a picture, we call those pixels. That's the definition of a pixel. All right, so what is this magic frequency that we have to sample at in order to get to the sampling theorem? Well, remember that Fourier told us that the wave at the top was a sum of regular Fourier waves. It's always true. Kotelnikov said, find the Fourier wave in the sum that adds up to the given signal of the highest frequency. Find the one of the highest frequency, and I contend it's the one I show here because nothing wiggles any faster than that in the given signal, and sample the signal at twice that rate. You'll notice that's the dots are twice the rate, twice the frequency of that particular Fourier frequency. All right, that's the first half of the great sampling theorem, which I hope astonishes you. It's not, by the way, it doesn't say the samples are an approximation. It says it's an exact representation. Okay. Then the other half of the theorem says, okay, given the samples, say 10 years later on the other side of the planet, you want to get back the original signal that these samples represent. And in this case, listen to them. How do you do that? Well, you remember this shape from I call it a spreader from Kotelnikov's 1933 paper. Unfortunately, this shape has a problem in the real world. Those wiggles go off to the right and the left forever. In other words, this wiggly function, the spreader function, is infinitely wide, and we can't deal with things infinitely wide in the real world. So what we do is we replace it, we approximate that perfect spreader with a pretty darn good approximation like this one. You'll notice the middle lobe stays about the same. There are 2 negative lobes. And this it goes to 0 for most out to infinity. So it's got a small finite width. Okay, Kotelnikov says to get your original signal back from the samples, put a copy of the spreader at each sample, adjust its height so it's scaled by the size of the sample, and then add up the result. And that bold wave at the top, that bold curve at the top, is the original signal. That's the magic. Somehow the missing infinities that we seems like we threw them away get restored by the infinities of the spreader. All right, now let's jump to the case of pictures where the signal is two-dimensional. The samples form what I think of as a bed of nails, the pixels, we call them pixels, and the spreader function looks like this. If you drop a guillotine down to the top of that little hillock, you'll see that the cross section is the one-dimensional spreader that we used in the preceding set of slides. And here's a picture of a single sample, which is a pixel now. It's a pixel being spread by a spreader function so that we can see what the original picture was that that pixel represents. Now, this is the point to stop and point out several important things. One, a pixel is zero-dimensional. It's a sample at a point. You cannot see a pixel. I think a lot of people find that surprising. You can't see a pixel until you spread it with a spreader function. So what are spreader functions in the real world? Well, remember I said I had several billion pixels here? I can only see about several million of them, because that's the resolution of the display here. This display has an array of little glowy spots, little glowy devices. Those little glowy devices are the spreader functions that the sampling theorem requires. So we send pixels to the display, and those little glowy spots do the spreading of the pixels, and they overlap. So it's a lot of people call these little glowy spots pixels, but that's a category error. These spots on a screen, which I call display elements, are analog. They overlap and they add together to form an analog surface, namely the original picture. Pixels are discrete, separated, choppy, not smooth or continuous at all, and you can't see them. So where did that pixelated set of little squares idea come from? And I contend that the criminal here is the magnify function or the zoom function that nearly all apps have. I've drawn a picture here of 14 gray pixels. You can see them, you can barely see them. Well, you're looking at spread versions of those pixels, of course, because you can't see the actual pixels. But what do we usually do? We want to see a picture like that up close. We magnify it or we zoom. Suppose we zoom by a factor of 100, we might see this. So we would conclude, wouldn't we? Seems like a natural conclusion that the little picture must have been little squares. The pixels must be little squares. But this magnify function is a lie, folks. It always has been. All it does, it's quick and dirty, and it worked in the bad old days, but we ought to get rid of it. All it does is it takes each pixel. Suppose we're magnifying by 100. It takes each pixel and replaces it with a 100 by 100 square array of copies of that pixel. And when you see that image spread on a display, what does it look like? It looks like little squares. What a surprise. But it's not a picture of this up close. If you do the proper sampling theorem magnification of this picture, you get this, where you can think of each of those blobs as being that little hillock I showed you earlier. You're looking down on it, and they overlap, and they're not squares. So we ought to get rid of that little square. That little square model is wrong. All right, so that's the first part of my talk. Second part is about the history of movie making. I thought this particular crowd probably knows something about that, but I bet you'd be surprised about the details as I was. Again, as I looked into the history of movies, I discovered that everything I thought I knew was wrong. I asked people, who made the first movies? And the answer always gets the same answers. it was Edward Muybridge, or it was Thomas Edison, or it was the Lumiere brothers. In France, it's always the Lumiere brothers. But it turns out not to be any of those guys. So this is I'm showing you, I don't want you to understand all the details on this chart. It's too scary. I just want to show you the approach I use to give, to present the details of a high technology history. Turns out that the story of a genius from which all things flow is just not true in the history of cinema and history of computers and history of anything. It just doesn't work like that. So this family tree or genealogy or flowchart method tells you how people interact to form the high technologies that we are interested in. And it shows you who stabbed who in the back. There's a lot of that went on in the movie making industry. So if you look, I'm not going to describe hardly anybody on this chart except these two people, and I'm only going to talk about one of them. It was, the best I can tell, it was William Kennedy Laurie Dixon who did most of the invention of the movie machine. And by movie machine, I mean camera, film, and projector. Without that, you haven't got a movie system. You can't just have one part, you got to have all parts. Who did it first? Well, it certainly wasn't Muybridge, and it wasn't Edison, and it wasn't the Lumieres. It was this guy, W.K.L. Dixon. And there was a counterpart of him in France named Georges Demigny, who served sort of the same function in France, but I'm not going to talk about him today. He's also been left out as much as William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. Here are some pictures just of these people. This is, I have to tell the story of Edward Muybridge because it's such a juicy story, even though he's not the guy. I claim he has nothing to do with the invention of movies. Everybody knows that Edward Muybridge, the guy on the right, took a photograph of Leland Stanford, the guy on the left, his racing horses with all 4 feet off the ground. And the story goes, the received story goes, that from there he created movies. But that's not, when I looked into it, that's not at all how the story goes. Turns out the guy, by the way, you probably screwed up your mouth when you tried to say his name, something like Edward Muybridge. No, his name was Teddy Muggeridge. He was just a kid from Kingston on Thames, England, and his name was Muggeridge, and I think he got made fun of because of that name, so he changed his name many times in his life. Muggeridge was the second version he used, then Muybridge finally when he was 32, and then he used that for about 3 years, and then for a few years he was just the one name. He was the one name, the alias Helios. He was a photographer of Yosemite, a pretty good photographer, an artistic photographer, went by the name Helios. And then he changed again to Muybridge. And at that point, he changed the spelling of Edward to this weird spelling, Edward. Folks, it's just Edward. He took it from the coronation stone that you can see at the left in his hometown, Kingston on Thames, where several kings of England, 2 or 3 of which were named Edward, were crowned. And so far as his creating the movies, it's just not so. What he did was he took pictures of the horses going by, of the horse going by, and he had an artist basically rotoscope those images onto a disc. Now these discs are big, they're bigger than a long playing record, they're really large. And he had the artist stretch each horse horizontally to make up for a flaw in the projection system of his device, which is called a zogopraxiscope. So I just couldn't bring myself to believe that a person who didn't use film frames and who rotoscoped and who stretched invented the movies, and they were only like 12 frames long, 11 frames long. That just couldn't possibly be the invention of movies. So, but what he did do, he was like the Johnny Appleseed. He took his ideas around the world and showed them to people like Thomas Edison, the guy on the left here. And Edison looked at that and said, he knew immediately it was a crummy idea, but I mean, the device was a crummy idea, but the idea of moving subjects the idea of the movie itself was a pretty good idea, he thought, and he sat down and sketched a device that couldn't work at all, but it got his people thinking about how to make movies. The person in his lab who actually did the work is the fellow on the right, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. Not only did he build the camera for Edison, but he also mastered the 35 millimeter film format that became the standard last century, 4 per frame. And then when he couldn't talk Edison, then he noticed that Edison was stealing all the credit from him for these inventions. He left Edison and joined another company called Biograph. One reason he left was because Edison wouldn't build a projector. And he understood, Dixon understood that a projector was fundamental to the idea of the movie business. So Biograph built a projector. So William Kennedy Laurie Dixon had the first full system, and was also Edison's biggest competitor. And basically they fought all their lives, and Edison got the credit, Dixon didn't, but I think that's going to change. I learned a lot about him from the curator of the Library of Congress, who's written the first really serious biography of Dixon, in which I used a great deal in the research for my book. Okay, that's one history, which lots of interesting people. It doesn't match the versions, the received versions of that I had received along the way. As I said, typical of the many histories I studied for this book. But now I want to talk about computer graphics. This goes back, the history, of course, computers are involved. Computers, we actually do have a single hero from which all of computation derives. Now, it doesn't derive in a straight line at all. There's no easy story, but it does go back to one guy, Alan Turing, the guy on the left. This is a picture of him winning a marathon, I think, in Cambridge, England. In 1936, so Kotelnikov proved the sampling theorem in 1933. Alan Turing invented computation in 1936. And by the way, and more importantly than the fact he invented computation, he invented the stored program computer. I don't think most people understand it was Turing who invented the computer as we now know it. Usually it's some engineers given that credit, but it's not so. If you read the proof of his original basic paper, the one that all computation is based on, there it is. He's got you change a program to change the algorithm that this device computes. By the way, I have a little business card version that I created to show how simple a computer actually is. This, in other words, this universal Turing machine could compute Toy Story, but it would probably take the lifetime of the universe to do it. So the race was on to turn Turing's very slow idea into a very fast implementation. In other words, turn it into hardware. One person who knew exactly what Turing was up to is this fellow, John von Neumann. John von Neumann, I love this picture because he's the only guy on the edge of the Grand Canyon wearing a 3-piece business suit and facing the wrong direction on his mule. Von Neumann was a genius by anybody's measure. He knew exactly what it was that Turing had done. And they all headed off to start to build the first computers. Alan Turing, so here's another one of these charts where I try to show you the genealogy or the family of the people involved who actually made the early computers happen. Turns out that Alan Turing tried to build the Pilot Ace, and it should have by all rights been the first computer. It was Alan Turing, but he ran into bureaucratic walls, at least bureaucratic walls, and it didn't happen. It wasn't the first computer. It might have been the 10th or something like that. Meanwhile, von Neumann and his people came up with an architecture that was very popular, and almost everybody in the row, this row, the horizontal row there is a list of some of the first computers, use the so-called von Neumann architecture and not the Turing architecture, which is actually more sophisticated, to get to the first computers. I have baby circled, and I'm also going to talk about whirlwind and not and ignore the rest of them. The engineers who built Baby were Freddie Williams and Tom Gilbert, and the reason they won, Baby was the first computer, by the way. And Williams and Gilbert won the race to the first computer because they came up with the first CRT memory. They came up with the first electronic memory. All right. Now that memory is important because it doubled as a display. I went to visit Baby in Manchester, England in 2013. And this is Baby. It's one rack of equipment. It's lots of racks. And this is on its display. And the word Pixar was scrolling to the right. The point of, and this blew my mind, the first computer named Baby, believe it or not, had pixels and it could animate. The first computer. So digital light, by digital light, I mean all pictures made of pixels. Digital light began when computers began. They're joined at the hip. I poked around a little bit and found the actual first picture that was made on Baby. Tom Gilbert did it, and he stopped to take a picture. Now, this is unusual. I want you to notice there are no little squares, even on the very first digital picture. It's unusual because when you talk to the old timers, I started looking around for other old pictures. They said, Alvy, even if we made pictures, we wouldn't tell you about it. In other words, they thought pictures were a frivolous use of their wonderful computing machines, and they didn't want to be accused of forbidden fruit, use of forbidden fruit. But that sensation went away quite rapidly. By 51, so Baby was 48. By 51, also in Manchester, there was an interactive game that I found that not only had existed on, it was big grandson of Baby. Notice I said it was interactive in 1951. And then in 1953, I found the third one. There was a game in 1952. And this one on the right was on the EDSAC computer at Cambridge University. There was another one earlier in 52, but nobody stopped and took a picture. Really hard to get pictures this time. But remember this, I was kind of shocked when I thought, wait a minute, interactive graphics in the early 50s? I thought it all started with Ivan Sutherland and Sketchpad in the early 60s. Something's wrong with the received story. Yet again, I came across that phenomenon. All right. But then, okay, remember the other computer I wanted to talk about on that from that preceding flowchart was Whirlwind. Whirlwind, by the time Whirlwind came along, nobody was denying that making pictures was fun and useful and very important on computers. In fact, Whirlwind had a graphics display, the first one. In other words, it was a display intended for showing pictures. It didn't double as a memory or something else. It was intended just for pictures. And I spent 2 days in the archives at MITRE Corporation, the Whirlwind archives, going through they took a lot of photographs, and I found, the first surface, no perspective, but it's a surface. A candidate from 53 for first game or first animation. I couldn't convince myself it was either, but I did find this bona fide first animation, 1951. Now, I showed you Pixar, and I told you that it animated on the 1948 computer, but nobody did that then. Nobody actually animated on Baby. But somebody did animate on Whirlwind in 1951, and this animation was shown on an Edward R. Murrow show. See it now. All right. Again, I want you to understand the flows that define our industry without spending too much time on the details. This chart is a continuation of the preceding one. The Whirlwind box here joins to the Whirlwind box in the preceding one. So you can see how these flows just keep going down. I'll add some more in a moment. One of the things that several things were wrong about the version of computer graphics history that I received. I've already pointed out that, wait a minute, there was interactive graphics in 51. What? That doesn't fit the Ivan Sutherland story. And how did Pierre Bézier and Steve Koopmans fit in? Well, I figured it out. I'm not going to spend time on that today, but I've figured out how they all fit together. I also found out some very interesting side stories. Let me just mention a couple without going into too much detail. If you look at the upper right, there's the Save from the Nazis grouping. Herbert Freeman was my first boss after I graduated from Stanford computer science. I took a job at New York University, and he was my chairman. Now, and he was a computer graphics guy, but nobody ever talked. He didn't fit in any of the other stories that I heard about. Yet he was the first computer graphics person that I actually knew. And he had been saved from the Nazis when he was a kid by none other than Albert Einstein, who wrote 3 letters in his behalf, saving him as a child. And in that same light, consider Marcelli Wine out to the right, who with Mr. Burtnick wrote the first interpolating computer interpolation program for animation. Marcelli was saved. Well, his father was saved from Auschwitz because he was a master tailor and he was number 5 on Schindler's List. Okay, these stories go on and on, but let me concentrate on these 3 guys. Keep coming back to Ivan Sutherland. He's a major player, but I knew something was wrong with his story, so I've searched it out and I'm going to give it to you today like I understand it. Now, here are pictures of those 3 guys side by side. They were all classmates at MIT at the same time. They worked on the same computer, TX2, some of the few people to have access to this very powerful computer. And Ivan Sutherland on the left wrote Sketchpad. But I've already told you, it can't have been the first interactive program because that happened back in the 50s. But what it was the first interactively re-rendered program, computer graphics program in 2D. Surprising to me, but Sketchpad was only 2-dimensional. In other words, the TX2 was fast enough anyhow in those days, that so that you could change the model stored in the computer memory and have that model re-rendered sufficiently fast that it felt like it was instantaneous. That's when we first started understanding the power of interactivity. But it wasn't 3D. The guy in the center, who nobody seems to have heard of, is named Tim Johnson. He wrote Sketchpad 3. Now, that doesn't mean version 3. That means the 3D version of Sketchpad. He was writing at the same time that Ivan Sutherland was writing Sketchpad. And not only was it 3D, but it displayed in perspective. The perspective was provided by the 3rd classmate, Larry Roberts, the guy at the right. Larry went on to gain great fame as one of the fathers of the internet. But poor Tim Johnson has got nothing. And you sort of see the problem if you look at these photographs. He looks so much like Ivan Sutherland that nobody has ever picked him out as unique. I went out to Google and asked for Ivan Sutherland images, and I got back over 60% of the pictures that came back were actually of Tim Johnson on Sketchpad 3, not Ivan Sutherland on Sketchpad. The 2 guys on the right introduced what I call the central dogma, that we will, it's an assumption that we make in computer graphics. It's usually, I don't think it's ever been articulated, that we will model using Euclidean geometry, 3D, and we will project that model into 2 dimensions using Renaissance perspective. There's nothing about computers that requires those 2 restrictions. I'll come back to that in a minute. So far, I've been talking about what I call epic 1 of computer graphics, of computer history. You see Baby at lower left, 1948. But in 1965, something remarkable happened. Beginnings of epic 2, defined by Moore's Law. Now, my version of Moore's Law, I think, is much more intuitive than the usual expression. Everything good about computers gets better by an order of magnitude, a factor of 10, in other words, every 5 years. That sounds so simple, but it is a mind blower. I want you to think about it for just a moment. We puny humans can't think more than an order of magnitude increase in anything. We just can't do it. We have to reconceptualize every time something changes by a factor of 10. Moore's law says that reconceptualization is going to happen every 5 years. Starting in 1965, when Moore's law factor was 1, it has, and today Moore's law factor sits at about 100 billion x. I made my first graphic in 1964, so just before Moore's law, and computers today are 11 orders of magnitude better than they were back then. We don't have the machinery, the mental machinery to know what that means. One way to know what it means is just to have lived through it. I was born before computers, and I've lived through this entire history. So I have a sense, but it's almost impossible to have people understand what it felt like to have only 1,000x Moore's law. And you shouldn't have to. And we're going to reach 1 trillion x very soon. Moore's law is still alive and well, despite frequent announcements of its death. What Moore's law means to you and me is color. The first color pixels came along in 67 because of Moore's law. And I went in search of them for this book and found them. They were on the Apollo Moon Project, a simulator for the Apollo Moon Project. And that was built at General Electric for NASA by Rob Ruggero and Bob Schumacher. And you can see it was also the first color shaded graphics in 3D. 1967. This was quite a bit earlier than I had guessed it was. I thought I'd had the first color pixels at Xerox in the early 70s. Not true. All right. Continuation of that preceding chart. Ivan Sutherland and Herbert Friedman are the connecting points. The two guys I just mentioned are in the upper left, Ruggero and Schumacher. Basically, you can see this chart's exploding exponentially too. I just want to talk about the path I know best, New York Tech, Lucasfilm, Pixar. But I also want to point out that the same flows braided together in different ways to give us DreamWorks and Blue Sky. So let's talk about my path through that, because I know it best, but that's also happening simultaneously. I already mentioned that. I should add that Don Greenberg shared a puck tent when he was a freshman with Rod Ruggero, and from that sharing with the guys who brought us the color pixels came the Cornell University juggernaut of computer graphics excellence. All right, jump 5 years ahead of that, so that's an order of magnitude by Moore's law, and we come to my partner, the guy who started Pixar with me, Ed Catmull, and his famous hand that he animated with shaded graphics in 1972 at the University of Utah. And at the same time, his classmate Fred Park was doing animated faces. But simultaneously with them, the guys descending from Don Greenberg at Cornell did the first color shaded graphics movie. Now here's the Xerox Paint program where I first encountered color pixels on a program built by my best friend Dick Schaup at Xerox Park. And I, for years, thought we had the first color pixels. We didn't, but it was a marvelous experience. And I grew up painting pictures, so oils on canvas. So this is my chance to combine two of the things that I know about painting and computers. And I also did some theoretical work. I added the HSB color transform. But Xerox let me go. So they fired me. And to not make too hard a point of it, they decided their corporate decision was not to do color. So I had to find the next color pixel memory, and I found it at this place, the New York Institute of Technology, which was owned by this man, Alexander Schur. Now, this is a fabulous place. It was on the North Shore of Long Island, where all the giant estates are. Alexander Schur, Uncle Alex, as we called him, had cobbled together 4 estates, and the buildings, the mansions on those estates were the buildings on his school, New York Institute, New York Tech. So this building, for example, was where we did video. And through the woods to the left, about a quarter mile, was another mansion, Gary House, where we did computer graphics. Now, we were there because Alexander Schurer was doing an animated movie the old-fashioned way, cell animation, a la Disney, the classic ink on celluloid way. And he had this idea that somehow computers would make this more efficient. Of course, that was the right idea, but Alex was way ahead of his time and basically lost everything, but not before he really got us started. The group now known as Pixar got us started. One of the things he did was he bought us the first 24-bit pixels in the world. It was only a 512 by 512 pixel memory, but it cost him $1 million in today's money. And we went nuts making art. And by the way, I met Ed Catmull at this place. Ed was there to found his way here too. And we invented the Alpha channel, and that's where we had the idea that we should, hey, we watched these old animators work. So why don't we be the first group to make a digital movie, completely digital movie? Not this tedious way these guys are working. That's where we had the first vision, not realizing it was going to take us 20 years to get there. 75 to 95. Personally, a big event that happened to me at New York Tech was I collaborated with this guy, Ed Lantz, to make a piece called Sunstone with some really, it had 3D computer graphics in it, as you can see the frame at the right, but very simple models, but they're anti-aliased. So we were just starting to get there. But we decided, no, we didn't decide. We understood finally that Uncle Alex didn't have what it takes to help us make the first digital movie. So when George Lucas asked us to come join him, we did. Several of us, Ed and I and David and Tom Duff and some others, leapt from New York Tech to Marin County, where George Lucas was located. And I think you know that the group that became Pixar did the Genesis demo in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, not one of George's movies. He didn't understand what he had until we did this piece, and then he got it. But you'll notice that there were no characters in Star Trek II. So we wanted to do characters. Ed and I were fans of character animation. So 2 years later, in '84, we premiered a piece that I directed. I'd hired this guy, John Lasseter, one of the world's great animators. And I'm showing you 4 frames from Andre and Wally, which is the first time out with John as our animator. Why I'm showing you is these 4 frames is that they're 4 successive frames. And what I'm showing off here is that we had mastered motion blur, one of those things we had to master in order to be ready for the big time. Same year, 1984, one of my geniuses, as I call them, Tom Porter, created this piece. Again, showing that we had mastered all the technology that we needed in order to pull off and be ready for the big screen. This brings up the central dogma again, because we're going to add one more restriction to what it is we do in computer graphics. We're going to use Newtonian physics for our motion and optics. Again, there's nothing about computers that requires Newtonian physics. Then we had an opportunity, we thought, to make the movie, which is what we call the first complete digital movie. A Japanese firm came to us and said, we would like to pay for you guys to make the first movie based on the monkey characters that people in Asia grow up with. And by the way, I was a real fan of monkey stories, having been to China in 1978, coming back with like 8, 10, 12 volumes of monkey stories and art books. And John started drawing character studies for the monkey character, and we were ginning away on this project when it became time for me to sit down and charged the Japanese company for the production. Now, nobody had ever costed a Central Dogma movie before, animated movie before, 3D animated movie before. So I threw everything I knew at it, and much to my dismay, I realized we were one order of magnitude shy. We needed 5 more years of Moore's Law improvement in order to make a movie. Now that piece of knowledge came at just the right time, so I had to back out of the monkey deal. But just at that time, George and Marcia Lucas got divorced. And in California, half the fortune goes with each spouse. I went to Ed and I said, Ed, you know what? We're going to get fired. George has lost half his fortune. He never understood who we are or what we want to do. Let's start a company. This is 2 computer nerds talking to each other. Let's start a company so that we have a home for these geniuses that we've collected together. Then we can hold them together for 5 years so we can get to the movie. And it's sure. And we went across the street and bought How to Start Company books at a bookstore. And I guess the amazing thing is that it worked, but it was really hard. We got turned down by 35 venture capital. We had to finance this thing. By the way, we couldn't do a movie because we knew about the monkey from Monkey that we couldn't do a movie. So we decided we'd build hardware. So we're looking for somebody that would take us into the hardware business. Capitalize that. 35 venture capital firms turned us down, and 8 large corporations turned us down. We almost closed the deal with General Motors and Philips, but that fell through at the very last minute. I mean, the night before the signing, it fell through in a dramatic way that I won't bother you with tonight. But that's when Ed and I had this Hail Mary idea. Let's call Steve Jobs. Now, we already knew Steve Jobs because after he got kicked out of Apple, he called Ed and me down to his mansion and said, in Woodside near Palo Alto, and said, I want to buy you guys for my next stunt. I want to buy you guys from George Lucas and run you as my next company. We went, no, we want to run our own company, but we'll take your money, your investment. And he agreed to that. But the valuation he put on the deal was about half of what General Motors was talking. And the General Motors deal looked really hot at the time. So basically, Steve kind of got laughed out of the Lucasfilm office. But a few months later, General Motors deal fell through. Ed and I are frantic. We call Steve Jobs and say, make exactly the same offer again at half the valuation and all that. Lucasfilm's going to go for it, and they did. And so that's how we got Steve Jobs as our investor, our venture capitalist. He did not buy us. That's a common mistake. He did not buy us. He capitalized the spin-out corporation called Pixar. And for 5 years, we were a hardware company. And frankly, our hardware was really good stuff. We weren't a very good hardware company, even though we had Steve Jobs, a hardware guy, sitting on the board. He didn't know how to turn our hardware company into success. But I won't belabor you with those pretty lousy 5 years, but except to say that Steve would not, every time we ran out of money, which was frequently, he would write another check and take away equity rather than suffer the embarrassment of us going broke after his being kicked out of Apple. All right, but after 5 years, Moore's Law got there. Disney knocked on our door and said, okay, guys, let's make that movie. And we made Toy Story. Toy Story came out in '95. I round that off to the millennium just because it's convenient. And about the same time, those other braids came together, and DreamWorks came out with Ants, and Ice Age, Blue Sky came out with Ice Age. And you know the story. A lot of most of you here were probably sharing in the same flows in different parts. Anyhow, those 3 movies, in my opinion, at the millennium, were bright, shining, colorful flags announcing to the world that the great digital convergence of all old analog media types into the one new digital medium had occurred, and the era of digital light had begun. And that's what my book is about. Thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.